Welcome to a journey unlike any other. Today, we race stepping back into a time of unimaginable fear and suffering into the heart of one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, the Black Plague. This event, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, didn't just wipe out entire populations, it fundamentally transformed the world. With death looming over every corner, societies crumbled, families were torn apart, and the human spirit was tested in ways we can scarcely comprehend today. The Black Plague, or the Bubonic Plague, killed an estimated 25 to 30 million people across Europe in just a few years, about a third of the continent's population. And though we often hear about the numbers, the staggering death toll the human experience of living through the plague is much harder to grasp. It's not just about the bodies. It's about the fear, the isolation, the emotional toll, and the deep, haunting trauma that survivors carried with them long after the disease had passed. But how did it feel to walk through a world where death was a constant companion? Where the very air you breathed could carry the disease? How did people cope? Not just with the physical toll of the plague, but with the emotional devastation it brought. And how did the world rebuild itself after such an overwhelming disaster? In this video, we're going to go beyond the facts and figures to explore what it was really like to survive the Black Plague. We'll walk through the streets of Europe during this time, feeling the weight of fear in the air and the grief that filled the hearts of survivors. But we'll also explore the impact of the plague on the course of history. How did it change the political, social, and religious landscapes? How did it affect the psyche of the people who lived through it? From the rise of religious fervor to the development of medical practices, we'll delve into the long-lasting consequences of this deadly event. So, prepare yourself for an immersive experience as we dive deep into the Black Plague. The fear, the survival, and the aftermath of one of humanity's darkest hours. Let us uncover what it was really like to live through the Black Plague and how its legacy continues to shape us today. Segment 1. What it was really like to live through the Black Plague, and more to truly understand what it was like to live through the Black Plague, we must first take a step back and immerse ourselves in the overwhelming atmosphere of fear that defined the age. Imagine a world where death is no longer a distant, abstract concept, but a constant, looming presence. A time when cities, towns, and villages across Europe were struck by a mysterious force, one that spared no one. The Black Plague was not just a disease, it was an apocalypse, unfolding with terrifying speed and accuracy. People had little understanding of disease at the time, but they were acutely aware of its symptoms. Imagine watching loved ones fall ill before your very eyes. It started with fever, chills, and aching limbs, symptoms that could easily be mistaken for any other illness. But then, the telltale sign appeared, buboes. These painful, swollen lumps would emerge in the groin, armpits, or neck, often growing to the size of an apple, dark and tender, seeping with pus. Victims would writhe in agony, some succumbing to septic shock within hours, others lingering in pain for days before death claimed them. It was a grotesque and rapid process, as the disease would often spread so quickly that by the time you realized someone was infected, they were already beyond help. The speed with which the plague claimed lives was staggering. Entire families would be wiped out in a matter of days. Imagine the emotional devastation of a mother losing her children, a child losing their parents, in such a short span of time. There was no opportunity for proper goodbyes, no closure, just an overwhelming flood of grief and disbelief. People didn't have time to process their emotions before they were hit with the next wave of death. The very fabric of human relationships was torn apart. Death became an ever-present companion, lingering in every room, on every street, in every corner of the city. But it wasn't just the immediate terror of the disease that struck fear into the hearts of people. It was the uncertainty, the not knowing when or how you might be next. People were forced to abandon logic and fall into superstition and panic. Some believed the disease was a divine punishment. Religious fervor soared as people prayed for deliverance, sought the protection of saints, or even took extreme measures like flagellating themselves to appease God. Others turned to witchcraft, charms, and amulets, hoping for a magical cure or a protective spell that would keep the plague away. In cities, the streets became eerily empty as people fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the plague's grip. But the disease was relentless. It followed them, spreading from one town to the next, from one port to another, as ships carrying infected rats and fleas unwittingly carried the disease to new regions. No one, it seemed, was safe. For those who stayed behind, the situation was even more dire. With no resources to handle the overwhelming number of bodies, the streets were filled with the stench of death. Mass graves were dug, and the dead were piled together, often without proper ceremony or dignity. In some places, the death toll was so high that entire communities were wiped off the map. The living struggled not just to survive the disease, but to manage the immense burden of grief. Towns turned into ghost towns, and homes once filled with life became silent tombs. But even amidst the despair, there were moments of resilience. Some people, in their desperation, took action. They burned their clothes, their homes, and anything that might have been contaminated in a last-ditch effort to protect themselves. Others stayed with their loved ones, providing comfort and care until the end, holding on to the last remnants of their humanity in the face of such brutality. It wasn't just the physical suffering that took its toll. The emotional and psychological damage of the Black Plague was far-reaching. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world. There were those who rebuilt, tried to return to some semblance of normal life, and worked to recover from the trauma. But for many, the memory of those years, the faces of lost loved ones, the terror, and the helplessness lingered long after the disease had passed. In the aftermath of the plague, Europe was left with a profound sense of loss. The social structure had been upended. The old hierarchies and systems of power were shaken to their core. Many who had once been at the mercy of landowners and merchants now found themselves in a position of relative power, with the labor force decimated and the demand for workers at an all-time high. This would lead to significant economic changes, some of which laid the groundwork for the rise of the middle class. The Black Plague didn't just wipe out a third of Europe's population. It changed everything. It forced societies to reevaluate their relationship with religion, science, and even their basic understanding of life and death. It revealed the fragility of human life and the vulnerability of society, and though the plague eventually passed, its effects would continue to be felt for generations. Survivors lived with the knowledge that the world they had once known was gone, replaced by a new reality shaped by loss, survival, and a haunting memory of what had been. Segment 2, the biography of Pope Clement VI and the struggle for control. Scene 1. A grand cathedral in the heart of medieval Europe. The camera fades into the soft glow of a medieval cathedral, its towering stone walls reaching high into the heavens, filled with shadows cast by flickering candles. A cold, heavy silence fills the air, broken only by the faint sound of distant chanting. The scent of incense lingers, mixing with the cool stone and musty wood of the ancient structure. In the background, stained glass windows depict scenes of divine judgment. Angels and saints' images that once brought comfort now take on a more ominous tone. As Europe finds itself standing on the precipice of disaster, pause. The Black Plague is here, and the world feels it. The camera pans over the cold stone floor, worn down by the footsteps of generations who sought solace here. The space once filled with prayers of hope now feels empty, as death looms on every corner of the city. The familiar rhythm of life has stopped, replaced with uncertainty and fear. Scene 2. Inside the Papal Palace. Pope Clement VI in discussion cut to the Papal Palace, a grand but oppressive building, cold and full of the scent of ancient parchment and ink. The camera slowly zooms in on Pope Clement VI, a middle-aged man with a solemn expression, seated at a heavy wooden table. He is surrounded by his closest advisors, each one grim, their faces weary with the weight of the crisis at hand. Clement's eyes scan the faces of his advisors, his mind racing as he contemplates his next move. The silence in the room is thick, heavy with the uncertainty of the future. His hands, adorned with the rings of the papacy, rest on a pile of scrolls and documents. Each piece of paper is a lifeline, a desperate plea for action. But the answers remain elusive. Clement's voice breaks the silence. What can we do? How do we guide our people when death has no mercy? Pause. His advisors, dressed in the finest robes of the church, shift uneasily in their seats. The uncertainty is palpable. Outside, the chaos of the plague rages, yet inside, there is no clear path forward. The Pope's voice softens as he turns toward a large window. He watches the city below, dark and cold. We must act. The faith of the people is slipping away. I cannot allow the plague to also destroy the church. Clement's gaze hardens. He has heard the whispers, the rumors of those who believe the plague is God's wrath upon humanity, a divine punishment for sin. Some say the church is complicit in the suffering, that it has failed to protect its flock. Others, even within the Vatican, suggest that the Pope has lost his way, that the church no longer holds the power it once did. Scene 3. The Pope in the midst of a religious ceremony. The scene transitions to a grand cathedral once again, this time filled with hundreds of people. The camera focuses on Clement VI, now standing in his full papal regalia, the intricate gold embroidery glinting under the dim candlelight. The sound of bells ringing fills the air, signaling the start of the Mass. The Pope raises his hands in the air, offering a blessing to the assembled crowd. His eyes are focused, yet there is a noticeable weight to his demeanor. He speaks the words of salvation, his voice echoing through the ancient stone halls. O Lord, deliver us from this affliction, Clement intones, his voice reverberating across the cathedral. His words should bring comfort, but in the hearts of many, they fall on deaf ears. How can faith provide solace when the plague sweeps away families, cities, and lives? Clement pauses, looking round at the faces of the worshippers. Some are huddled in prayer, while others stand motionless, the weight of despair visible on their faces. Scene 4. The Black Death descends, panic among the people. The camera cuts to the streets outside the cathedral. The once bustling marketplaces of medieval Europe are now eerily silent, with only a few survivors walking in the midst of the chaos. The streets are filled with the stench of death. Families, their faces grim with grief, hurriedly carry their dead loved ones to mass graves, bodies piled high like discarded sacks of grain. The camera lingers on the streets. A mother, clutching her child to her chest, eyes wide with fear as she walks through the empty square. In the background, a cart loaded with corpses is slowly pushed toward the burial ground, and the toll of the bells grows louder, a reminder of the ever-present threat that hovers over them. Suddenly, the scene shifts to the homes of the wealthy. Noblemen and women, clad in fur-lined cloaks, hurriedly prepare to flee their estates. Panic is evident on their faces. They rush to their horses, their eyes scanning the horizon as they leave their homes behind. unable to escape the invisible enemy that is the plague. The fear is universal. Even those with power and wealth cannot escape. The rich, the powerful, and the religious are all equally vulnerable, and they know it. Scene 5, Clement VI in seclusion, struggling with religious and political control back in the papal palace. Clement VI withdraws to his private chambers. The room is cold, dimly lit by the flickering flames of a lone candle. He walks slowly to a large window and gazes out at the city, which is now a ghost town. The once proud streets are now barren, save for the occasional figure huddled in a doorway or fleeing for their life. Clement presses his fingers to his forehead, deep in thought. He knows the church's authority is in danger, but how can he lead when even his faith falters? How can he offer comfort when he, too, feels the crushing weight of fear? His voice breaks the silence again, quiet and filled with doubt. Is God punishing us? Pause. The air in the room grows heavier, the silence almost unbearable. Clement, sitting in the dim light, appears fragile, a man weighed down by his own responsibility. The pressure to protect both the faith and his people has never been greater, and the weight of the responsibility is now his burden to bear. Scene 6. Clemency and power. The Pope takes bold action. Days pass, and the darkness seems to deepen. But Pope Clement VI knows he must act. A man of both faith and strategy, he understands that the plague threatens not only the lives of his people, but the very fabric of society. The Church must be a symbol of hope, even if it feels like hope is slipping away. Clement stands tall, his robes billowing round him as he makes his way through the halls of the Vatican. His footsteps echo through the empty corridors. He stops in front of a large altar, its candles casting dancing shadows across the stone. With steady hands, he writes a decree, sending out messages of hope, calling for repentance and prayer, for healing through faith. We will endure this trial, he declares, his voice ringing with authority, even as doubt gnaws at the edges of his resolve. He knows this is his moment, the moment that will define his legacy. It is not just about saving lives, it is about saving the soul of Europe, restoring the belief of the people in a time when faith is being tested to its limits. Scene 7. The Pope's lasting legacy reforms amidst crisis as the Black Plague finally begins to recede. Pope Clement VI's actions, though not without criticism, ensure his place in history. While the Church's grip on power may have been shaken, Clement's leadership during the crisis solidified his legacy. His ability to guide the people through the darkest hours, though flawed, was a testament to the resilience of both the Church and the human spirit. The camera slowly zooms out from Clement, now older and weary, standing before the gates of a recovering Europe. The streets, though still scarred, show signs of life returning, people rebuilding, praying, and trying to heal the wounds that the plague had left behind. Clement's legacy was one of both perseverance and imperfection, but in the face of such calamity, it was enough to inspire rebirth, and as Europe moved forward, it would never forget the lessons learned from the Black Plague and the leadership of Pope Clement VI, who had stood firm when the world seemed to crumble round him. In 1347, whispers of a deadly illness began to spread through Europe. At first, it was just a few rumors, but soon it became undeniable. The Black Plague, a disease unlike anything seen before, began claiming lives at an alarming rate. It moved with terrifying speed, sweeping through villages, towns, and cities, leaving only death in its wake. Scholars, physicians, and religious leaders scrambled to find an explanation, but no one could make sense of the devastation. Some believed it was caused by miasma, poisonous vapors that filled the air. Others were convinced that it was a divine punishment from God for the sins of mankind. Some even theorize that an alignment of the planets had somehow unleashed this catastrophe. But none of these explanations offered any comfort, and none could explain the sheer scale of what was happening. The disease had no clear origin. It was as though it had appeared from nowhere, attacking without warning and claiming victims without mercy. People didn't understand what was happening, so they turned to superstition and fear. They wore masks filled with herbs, hoping to ward off the disease. They burned incense and offered prayers, thinking that perhaps divine intervention was the only hope they had left. But the plague didn't care about their prayers or their superstitions. It continued to spread. Relentless and unstoppable. Whole families died within days, their bodies piling up as the disease moved from one person to the next. In their panic, people searched for someone to blame. Many pointed to the Jews, accusing them of poisoning the wells and spreading the disease. The baseless accusations led to violence, with Jewish communities across Europe becoming targets of hatred and fear. They were blamed for something they had no control over, and in their suffering, they became scapegoats for a world trying desperately to make sense of a catastrophe they couldn't explain. Yet the true cause of the plague remained hidden for centuries. No one knew that the disease was spread by fleas carried on rats. The real cause of the devastation was small, invisible creatures that the people could not see. It was only much later that the true nature of the plague was understood. But by then, Europe had already paid a heavy price. The impact was devastating. Towns and villages were wiped off the map. The population of Europe was decimated, and the social and economic fabric of society collapsed. The rich and poor alike suffered, and no one was immune. The plague had come without warning and left a world forever changed. In the aftermath, survivors were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world. The plague had taken everything: loved ones, livelihoods, and, in many ways, their sense of security. People had to rebuild from the ruins, but the scars of the plague would remain. It changed the way people thought about life, death, and faith. It forced Europe to confront its own vulnerabilities and flaws. The fear and grief that accompanied the plague lingered for generations, and though the disease eventually subsided, the impact it had on Europe was profound. The Black Plague had shaped the course of history, leaving behind not only a trail of death, but also a deeper understanding of the fragility of human life. The social elite during the Black Plague, and more when the Black Plague descended upon Europe in 1347. No one, regardless of their status, was truly safe from its devastating effects. Yet, while the common folk lived in the streets, often scrambling for food and shelter, as they struggled to understand what was happening, the social elite, from the nobility to the clergy, faced the crisis from a completely different vantage point. Their experience, though filled with luxury and privilege, was just as fraught with fear, confusion, and helplessness. The initial reactions of the elite. At first, the elite of Europe did not panic. They had the means to isolate themselves. Wealth and power gave them access to the best doctors, the finest homes, and the ability to flee to their rural estates or fortified castles. They had servants who cared for them, and they could control their surroundings in a way that was impossible for the masses. But that early sense of security would soon dissipate. The first reports of the plague had arrived with little fanfare, strange cases of fever and painful swellings in distant regions. Many of the nobles dismissed it as a passing sickness, something that would soon be contained. The aristocracy had seen outbreaks of diseases before, and this was, in their eyes, another temporary trial. But then, it came closer. The plague's arrival in major cities like Florence, Paris, and Venice shattered that illusion. Even the richest families, with all their power, could not escape the overwhelming tide of sickness that was sweeping through the streets. The disease arrived silently at first through trading routes, across the bustling markets where the wealthy would often purchase exotic goods, and along the very paths the elite traveled in their daily lives. The plague, invisible but lethal, made its way into the palaces and noble homes. The fear that gripped the nobility, the first victim was often a servant, a lower-class member of the household who contracted the disease from a neighboring town or from one of the many merchants who passed through their estates. The wealthy, already accustomed to luxury, began to retreat further into their gilded cages. The fear of contagion spread quickly, and soon, even the nobility could not ignore the inevitable reality of the plague's reach. Noblemen and noblewomen, who had lived their lives in a world of opulence and excess, found themselves shut away in their grand estates, terrified to leave the safety of their walls. Physicians who were hired to treat the most powerful families quickly found themselves unable to offer any real help. Many of them fled when they realized they had no power over the disease. The wealth and privileges that once provided security now meant little in the face of a disease that no one could understand. Wealth cannot protect from death. One of the most striking elements of the plague was that no amount of wealth or power could protect anyone from its grip. This universal vulnerability was felt deeply by the elite. Kings and queens, cardinals and bishops, all fell to the plague. Pope Clement VI himself, in the midst of a dying world, found himself sheltering in his own private residence, surrounded by an impenetrable guard to keep the plague at bay. The rumors that swirled round him were laced with dread, despite his power and his spiritual role as the head of the Catholic Church. He too was a man at the mercy of the same disease. The rich who once believed themselves invulnerable were now isolated, their palaces becoming prisons. They sent for the best medical care, but the best doctors had little more to offer than prayers and comfort. The medieval understanding of disease was so limited that even the most learned scholars and physicians were left helpless. These were men and women who had lived their lives in comfort and security, believing that their social and financial status could shield them from the world's cruelties. And now, faced with a disease that had no explanation, no cure, they were as powerless as the beggars in the street. The psychological toll on the elite, while the commoners suffered in the streets, facing death and disease head-on, the elite, isolated and surrounded by luxury, experienced a different kind of torment. The psychological toll of the Black Plague on the nobility cannot be underestimated. For them, it was a direct confrontation with their mortality. Their lives were, until now, marked by luxury, comfort, and an unshakable sense of control. They were accustomed to having everything at their disposal: land, power, riches, but suddenly, none of that mattered. Wealthy families who had once sat in the highest courts of Europe found themselves watching helplessly as their children, servants, and even themselves succumbed to the plague. How did it feel to sit in a great hall surrounded by gold and tapestries, only to hear the cries of the dying echoing in the distance? These aristocrats, who had once wielded immense power, could no longer do anything but wait for the inevitable. Some took refuge in religious fervor, hoping that piety and penance could protect them. In many places, rich families ordered prayers and masses to be held in their homes, offering donations to the church in the hopes of receiving divine protection. But the plague did not care for money or piety. Death in the upper echelons of society, as the plague continued to spread, it became clear that no one was safe. Not even the highest members of society. Kings died, queens died, even the rich and powerful clerics who had spent their lives building vast fortunes for the church were not spared. The death of some of these prominent figures was seen as symbolic. The idea that the very fabric of European society was being torn apart by an invisible, unstoppable force deeply shook the upper echelons of power. In Florence, the infamous Giovanni de' Medici, the head of one of the most powerful banking families, succumbed to the disease. His death marked a turning point. It was the first time that the elite of Europe realized that even their wealth and influence could not save them from death. The image of a nobleman or noblewoman dying in a bed, surrounded by silk sheets and luxury, while their servants and peasants suffered in the streets, was jarring. It was a moment of reckoning for the aristocracy. The plague did not care for status, for titles, or for power. In a time when society was rigidly structured, with the aristocracy perched at the top, the Black Plague offered a cruel lesson. Death was the great equalizer, rebuilding the elite's social and economic standing after the plague had subsided. Europe's nobility faced a difficult and complicated process of rebuilding. The aristocracy had been nearly wiped out, and the social and economic structure of society had been drastically changed. Fewer nobles remained to take up the mantle of power. The sudden scarcity of workers gave those who survived leverage. A new middle class, made up of surviving merchants, craftsmen, and landowners, began to rise to prominence, and the old elite had to come to terms with the changing social order. For those who remained, the wealth that once seemed unassailable was now subject to new and shifting dynamics. Estates that had once belonged to vast noble families were now in the hands of those who could afford to buy them, including those outside the traditional aristocracy. The nobility, in their desperation to recover what they had lost, were forced to adapt to a world where their old power was no longer guaranteed. Legacy of the plague on the elite, the Black Plague left a lasting imprint on Europe's aristocracy. Not only did it challenge the very notion of power and control, but it also altered the way the elite viewed life, death, and their place in the world. For those who survived, it was not just a physical and social trauma, but a spiritual one as well. They were forced to confront the reality that no amount of wealth, no title, no lineage could protect them from the forces of nature. The aristocracy, forever marked by their experiences with the plague, began to retreat into more private, guarded existences. Their sense of invulnerability shattered, many chose to focus on securing their legacy, often through more cautious approaches to wealth and power. The old ways of indulgence and excess gave way to a new era, where even the most powerful realized that their dominion over life and death had limitations. The Black Plague changed everything. It was a reminder that no matter how high one ascended in the social hierarchy, there would always be forces beyond one's control. The aristocracy, much like the rest of society, was now vulnerable. The plague had leveled the playing field in ways no one had anticipated, and the echoes of that devastation would be felt across generations. This expanded version delves deeper into the psychological impact of the plague on the aristocracy, offering a more nuanced view of how their world was changed. The tension and fear they experienced reflect the stark contrast between their usual control over society and the chaos the plague brought. Let me know if you would like further refinement or adjustments.